Listen to the chaotic noise bleeding out of the American media networks over the last 48 hours, and you will hear the sound of a superpower fundamentally misreading the room. Everyone south of the border is hyperventilating over Manitoba Premier Wab Canoe casually tossing a ban on American alcohol onto the table and then, with surgical precision, dangling the release of the Epstein files on live television. The pundits in Washington are calling it a cheap provincial tantrum. The talking heads and the algorithmic crowd think it is just another populist stunt meant to score cheap points during a tense trade dispute. I want you to pause for a second, shut off that noise, and look at the actual mathematics on the table. They are completely, spectacularly wrong. From my vantage point, dissecting the geopolitical capital of North America, I do not see a political stunt. I see cold, calculated physics. They think this is a petty fight over imported booze. It is actually about the $16.8 billion, yes, billion with a B, that our auto manufacturing sector pumped directly into the Canadian GDP in 2024. It is about the 1.31 million vehicles that rolled off our assembly lines. More importantly, it is about the 125,000 direct livelihoods that Donald Trump intended to wipe out with the stroke of a pen and a devastating 25% tariff threat on Canadian steel, aluminum, lumber, and autos. Think of international trade negotiations, not as a boardroom debate, but as a massive hydraulic press. In fluid dynamics, you do not need to match your opponent's crushing weight ton for ton to lift them off the ground. You just need to apply a highly concentrated, unrelenting pressure onto a very narrow, unyielding cylinder. Can knows that trying to match Donald Trump tariff for tariff is a fool's errand that would only bleed our own economy dry. Instead, he located the absolute narrowest valve in the American armor. A niche, highly visible consumer pain point like alcohol, spliced with the hypertoxic radioactive personal risk of the Epstein files. He pushes down on that tiny piston in Winnipeg. Because political risk is incompressible, that exact pressure travels straight down the line, magnifying exponentially through the system, until it forces the massive, multi-billion-dollar tariff piston in Washington to grind to a sudden halt. The macro event is the trade war, but the true impact of this leverage is felt in the micro-lacerations of everyday Canadian life. Imagine a third-generation steelworker walking off his shift in Hamilton this very evening. He has grease in his knuckles, aching joints, and a heavy mortgage in a housing market that simply does not forgive. For months, he has walked around with a cold knot in his stomach, watching foreign politicians treat his family's economic survival like a disposable casino chip. Then, he looks up at the muted screen in the break room and watches the American trade representatives sweating under Kim Yu's ultimatum. In that exact fraction of a second, the heavy realization hits him. He realizes his livelihood is not being protected by a fragile 500-page bureaucratic treaty drafted by apologetic diplomats in Ottawa. His job, his home, and his dignity are being shielded by a bottle of Kentucky bourbon aggressively ripped off a provincial liquor store shelf. And while the Americans are busy scrambling to contain the PR fallout and salvage their beverage exports, they remain completely oblivious to the catastrophic structural fracture opening up right beneath their own foundation. That catastrophic structural fracture I mentioned, it is the best thing that could have possibly happened to us. Let us address the 25% elephant in the room. The moment Donald Trump threatened to slap that massive tariff on our steel, aluminum, lumber, and autos, the financial commentators in Toronto practically wept on air. They called it an economic apocalypse. They pointed out the events of March 18, 2026, when Washington and Mexico City deliberately locked arms to open bilateral reviews of the USMCA framework, explicitly sidelining Canada and leaving us standing out in the cold. The media told you this isolation was a devastating diplomatic failure. I look at that closed door and I see the most counterintuitive, magnificent gift Washington has ever handed us. Let that sink in for a moment. They think isolation will break us. I think it is the exact high-voltage shock therapy this country has been begging for. For decades, we have been suffering from a quiet, fatal dependency. The North American free trade dream was, at its core, an architectural lie. It was a sprawling, glittering structure built on a fundamentally flawed concrete foundation. The implicit contract of the US-centric era was humiliatingly simple. Canada rips its raw, critical minerals out of the earth and ships them south at a steep discount, allowing the Americans to pour the foundational concrete for their own towering industrial empire. We were far too comfortable being the resource quarry for the United States. Trump's hostility is not destroying our economy. He is taking a sledgehammer to that parasitic foundation. By aggressively shoving us out of their closed-loop assembly line, Washington has inadvertently forced our hand. They are forcing us to stop leasing space in their basement and to finally drive our own heavy steel pilings deep into our own bedrock. Consider the violent physical reality of the supply chain. Think about a massive raw aluminum ingot forged in a Quebec smelter. Under the old comfortable rules of the Trade Pact, That ingot is unceremoniously strapped to a flatbed truck, driven straight across the Ambassador Bridge into Detroit, sold for pennies on the margin, and quietly absorbed into an American automaker's balance sheet. The immense compounding value is created over there, while we happily take the scraps. But today, with a brutal 25% tariff wall looming at the border, that flatbed truck has to slam on the brakes. It pulls a hard, screeching U-turn. That aluminum ingot is forced to stay home. Instead of bleeding out across the border to feed a foreign economy, it is driven straight onto the floor of a newly minted multi-billion-dollar gigafactory rising from the Ontario dirt. It is heated, cast, machined, and stamped into a high-value automotive chassis right here on sovereign soil. That U-turn, that single forced logistical pivot, is the exact mechanism that guarantees those 125,000 Canadian assembly jobs are not just saved, but permanently entrenched. The Americans thought their tariffs would starve us into submission. Instead, their isolationist selfishness has become the very spark required to restart the heavy manufacturing engine of the Canadian North. We are no longer just extracting, we are building. Yet, if you believe that reclaiming our domestic auto sector is the final objective of this geopolitical chess match, you are completely blind to the true scale of the battlefield. The real checkmate has nothing to do with cars, and it is unfolding thousands of miles away from the Windsor Corridor, buried deep beneath the ice. That deep ice is where the true pivot of power lies. You must understand that Premier Kinyu did not drop the Epstein files and the alcohol ban into the negotiation simply out of provincial spite. It was a masterclass in distraction. While the American politicians are busy hyperventilating over their liquor shelves and frantically managing the radioactive fallout of elite scandals, they are looking entirely in the wrong direction. The alcohol ban is the flashy magician's hand waving in front of your face. The real trick, the geopolitical killing blow, is happening quietly in the background, driven by Prime Minister Mark Carney in federal capital. I am talking about the Churchill liquefied natural gas corridor. For the entirety of our modern history, the Canadian energy sector has suffered from a chronic, debilitating arterial blockage. We sit on an ocean of resource wealth, yet our entire circulatory system was deliberately designed to flow only one way, south. Our pipelines act as a captive lifeline directly plugging into the American grid, forcing us to sell our premium energy at a brutal geographical discount because we effectively had only one massive monopolistic customer. We were a superpower in resources, but a vassal in distribution. The chaos in Washington and the threat of severe tariffs are the exact trauma needed to force an arterial bypass. When a primary artery is choked off by a political blood clot, the body does not simply die. It aggressively reroutes the flow, rapidly forcing new, massive capillaries to breach the surface. That is exactly what the aggressive 2030 timeline for the Churchill LNG project represents. The federal government, spearheaded by Carney, is throwing massive weight behind opening up this Arctic deep water port. This is not just an infrastructure project. It is a declaration of energy independence. By establishing a direct, ice-free maritime corridor through Hudson Bay, we are severing the umbilical cord to the United States. Think about the sheer, unadulterated terror this strikes into the heart of the American energy strategy. Suddenly, Canadian LNG does not have to be pumped down to the Gulf Coast to be sold on the global market on American terms. We will load it onto supertankers in our own north and ship it directly to an energy-starved Europe and a booming Asian market. The Americans inadvertently handed us the perfect political cover to accelerate a multi-billion-dollar sovereign energy corridor. We use their arrogance to justify our independence. We're actively decoupling our core economic engine from their chaotic political cycle. Washington thought they were imposing a blockade. They did not realize they were actually watching a prison break. And history tells us exactly what happens when a smaller nation uses a massive economic shock to break the chains of a dominant neighbor. Let me take you back to a moment in history that perfectly mirrors the chessboard we are looking at right now. I want you to look at the Franco-Italian Customs War of 1887. At the time, France was the undisputed economic leviathan of continental Europe, and they treated Italy exactly how Washington has historically treated us, as a captive, subservient market whose sole purpose was to feed the empire with cheap goods and absorb expensive exports. France assumed Italy would never dare bite the hand that fed it. But the Italians, completely exhausted by this industrial vassalage, did the unthinkable. They tore up the foundational trade agreement. The French response was immediate, arrogant, and merciless. Paris slammed the Italians with crippling tariffs, fully intending to starve them into absolute, humiliating submission. And yes, for a brief, agonizing window of time, the Italian economy bled. But the Italians did not crawl back to Paris begging for tariff relief. They absorbed the blow. They used that exact geopolitical shock to rapidly tear up their old dependent supply lines and build entirely new trade corridors northward. They punched new logistics routes through the Alps, forging massive independent trade networks with Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They suffered the short-term pain to permanently break the French monopoly over their sovereignty. Any metallurgist, welder, or heavy machinery operator listening to this inherently understands the physics of what happened to Italy and what is happening to us right now. I am talking about the violent, necessary process of quenching steel. When you need a structural beam or heavy-duty gear to be absolutely unbreakable, you do not just forge it in the comfortable, predictable heat of the furnace. You heat that raw iron until it is glowing red, soft, and entirely vulnerable. Then you pull it out and plunge it directly into a bath of freezing oil or water. It is a massive, violent thermal shock. The metal screams. But that exact, brutal trauma is what forces the crystalline structure inside the steel to aggressively realign. The sudden shocks locks the molecules into a state of extreme, unyielding hardness. Without the freezing shock, the steel remains soft and malleable. Without the pain, the metal inevitably fails under pressure. That is exactly what we are living through right now in Canada. The American tariff threats, the sudden isolation from the USMCA bilateral reviews, the chaos in the Windsor-Detroit transport corridor. This is our thermal shock. Washington thinks they are punishing us. They do not realize they are simply quenching the Canadian supply chain. They are forcing our logistics operators, our rail executives, and our port authorities to rapidly, aggressively realign our trade infrastructure away from a single catastrophic point of failure in the South. We are the Italy of the late 19th century. Only we are standing on a near-infinite arsenal of critical minerals, deep water ports, and energy. The temporary pain at the border is not a sign of collapse. It is simply the sound of our national economy hardening into something Washington can no longer bend. We are standing at the absolute terminal end of the U.S.-centric era. For my entire lifetime, and likely yours, the fundamental rule of Canadian economics was humiliatingly simple. When Washington sneezes, Ottawa catches a cold. A late-night social media post from the Oval Office used to be enough to send a cold sweat through the trading floors of Toronto and instantly paralyze capital investment in Alberta. Those days are over. They are dead and buried under the ice of the Churchill corridor and the heavy concrete of our new domestic assembly plants. The leverage Wab canoe pulled with the alcohol ban, the calculated injection of the Epstein files to paralyze their media cycle, the strategic, quiet velocity of Mark Carney pushing federal capital north, these are not isolated, desperate reactions. They are the deliberate, coordinated actions of a nation that has finally decided to stop asking for permission to be a global powerhouse. We are no longer waiting in the hallway to see what Donald Trump or the American legislature decides to do with our manufacturing sector. We are actively, aggressively decoupling. We are reshaping the North American supply chain on our own terms. And for the first time in a century, we hold the absolute high ground. But do not just take my word for it. I do not look at manipulated government employment reports to understand where the real economy is moving. I look at the ground floor. I look at you. If you're running a logistics hub, managing a rail yard, or overseeing a heavy manufacturing floor, I want you to do something for me today. Walk out to your dispatch board. Look at your shipping manifests, your waybills, and your heavy freight volumes over the last 90 days. Tell me in the comments below how much of your tonnage is suddenly pivoting away from that southern border. How much heavy freight is being forcibly redirected to domestic builds or being routed to the eastern and western seaports. That sudden shift in your logbook is not just a temporary routing change. It is the real-time, physical measurement of a nation finally standing up, cutting the cord, and taking its country back. Let me know what you see out there.